Hi, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight for Conversations Around the Table, the fight for racial equity in 2021 with Dr. Rashawn Ray here at the Anti-Racist Table. My name is Kirsten, and together with my sister, Lynn, we created the Anti-Racist Table as a multi-dimensional platform to help bring anti-racism into life as a daily practice. We do this primarily with our free 30-day challenge, which is self-paced and housed on our platform. It's great to do solo or with groups. It's a way to really put anti-racism into action. We know a lot of people are reading books, people have put out signs, but if you really want to do something tangible, to take action, to help dismantle anti-Blackness, you can do that with our challenge. It's really foundational anti-racist work. Let's see, what else did I want to tell you? We are super excited today to have Dr. Rashawn Ray. His scholarship, his outspokenness, his research, and his leadership on these key issues around anti-Blackness and the legacy it has today in America, such as health disparities, the wealth gap, policing, the need for reparations, Voting Rights Act. He is right there in the heart of it and a champion for these causes. And so we are very excited to have this conversation with him today. So thank you for joining us. Lynn is going to provide a land acknowledgement now. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lynn, and I would like to start our time together honoring the land that we occupy. This land acknowledgement is inspired by Ruth King, who's an African-American mindfulness practitioner who inspires us every day. So with that, I would like to call on my ancestors to stand with me as I acknowledge the native custodians of this land. The colonial name is Washington, D.C. It's the Anacostan land, and the Piscataway people are the original custodians of this land. Those people that are named, unnamed, known, unknown, past and present. We honor all traditions and traditional custodians of this region, and we recognize our continued connection with this land, with this water, and with this community. We pay respect to the earth, whose generous resources sustain us every day. And we pay respect to the enslaved African people of this land who were bought, held, and sold here, and all of their descendants, and all of the people throughout the world that are in captivity. We pay respect to their spiritual labor, and we pay respect to our ancestors whose unwise relationship to race and racism we have all inherited. We pay respect to our teachers and our elders, past, present, and emerging, and to all the young people today who are teaching us. We honor this gathering, everyone that's here, taking time to be with us and to do this important work of bringing anti-racism into your life as a daily practice to dismantle anti-Black racism and other social inequities. And especially, we appreciate the time and energy of Dr. Ray for being with us today and sharing his wisdom with all of us. May we recognize that we all share an aspiration for liberation, to be free in heart, mind, and body. Ashe, here ends our land acknowledgement.
Thank you. And now I am going to introduce our guest, Dr. Rashawn Ray, a David M. Rubenstein Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution. He's Professor of Sociology and Executive Director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, LASSR, at the University of Maryland in College Park. He is also one of the co-editors of Context magazine, Sociology for the Public. Formerly, Ray was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Research Scholar at the University of California at Berkeley. Ray's research addresses the mechanisms that manufacture and maintain racial and social inequality, with a particular focus on police-civilian relations and men's treatment of women. His work also speaks to ways that inequality may be attenuated through racial uplift activism and social policy. Ray has published over 50 books, articles, and book chapters in nearly 20 op-eds. Recently, Ray published the book, How Families Matter, Simply Complicated Intersections of Race, Gender, and Work, with Pamela Boy Jackson, and another edition of Race and Ethnic Relations in the 21st Century, History, Theory, Institutions, and Policy, which has been adopted nearly 40 times in college courses. Ray has written for the New York Times, Newsweek, Huffington Post, and NBC News. He was selected as 40 under 40 in Prince George's counties and awarded the 2016 UMD Research Communicator Award. He has also appeared on C-SPAN, MSNBC, HLN, Al Jazeera, NPR, and Fox News. His research has been cited by the Washington Post, Associated Press, Reuters, CNN, ESPN, Fox, The Root, and The Chronicle. He also served on the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington Planning Committee and the Commission on Racial Justice with Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And with that, welcome Dr. Rashawn Ray. We are so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really look forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Normally, we give our guests this time to do a land acknowledgement if they like, but we understand you're coming from the same place. So with that, we want to just dive right in. It's been quite a year. It's been a moment. Can you just give us your thoughts on where we are as a nation?
I think we're in a difficult place. We're in a fragile place, but it's a place where we have the ability to oftentimes choose and discern which way we go from here. The United States of America has been in similar positions before, particularly as it relates to racial inequality. Now, I will say, of course, we've dealt with pandemics, we've dealt with overt forms of racism before. Of course, we've dealt with economic collapse. But interestingly, I'm unsure if we dealt with all of them simultaneously in the way that we have. So, we do have to be conscious that as much as history tells us about this moment, there are things that are uniquely new. Social media, for example, the ability to communicate the way we do, the ability to have these particular conversations that we're having now are things that wouldn't have even been possible 5 or 10 years ago. So as I think about the moment where we're at, and this is what I appreciate so much about the anti-racist table, is to think about not only the problems and how we got here and the problems that create the racial disparities that exist, but also what we can do about it and how we might be able to learn from Reconstruction, failed Reconstruction, to be specific about it, and the 1877 Compromise, what we might can learn from some of the limits that stemmed from the Civil Rights Movement. And as much progress as the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act had, those legislations have been diluted over time. So when I think about the moment that we're in, I think we have to be very realistic that anytime we're in a modern era where life expectancy decreases significantly, that speaks to how far we went back and how far we still have to go. So we know that life expectancy is literally mimicking the racial disparities that we see in COVID-19. So among all Americans, life expectancy decreased close to 1 year. That's significant. That's 12 months. That's the length of time that we've been in COVID. But for Black people, life expectancy decreased by nearly 3 years. It's like 2.7 years. That is basically almost the same gap in COVID. And for Latinos, it's also a substantial gap, much higher than for whites. So, the bottom line is this: we can't take advantage of the American dream that is supposedly equitably available to everyone, even though we know that that's a farce. But even if we were to believe that, the differences in life expectancy suggest that people are not going to really be able to experience it in the same way that other people do.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that. You know, it brings us to some of what you talked about, which is, you know, how do we find healing? Where do we go for atonement? You know, you recently were talking about the executive orders that President Biden executed around racial equity, and you laid out 3 points that you feel, you know, are needed. Can you kind of walk us through that and what your thinking is?
Yeah, I mean, I think first we have to recognize and acknowledge that Joe Biden, similar to other presidents who have made massive transformations in regards to racial equality. So President Lyndon Johnson, President Kennedy, even we could think about obviously President Abraham Lincoln, who all have various resistances. And similar to Biden, I mean, kind of his history suggests that, obviously. I mean, his vice president even called him out on that on the campaign trail. But with that, and of course, then we have the crime bill. But when we look at what he's done more recently, and really, I really like to think about this in the context of starting with him being Barack Obama's vice president. We had to be very clear that Biden was Barack Obama's vice president, and now he's the president with Kamala Harris being vice president. So he's been the VP for the first Black president, and now he's president of the first Black VP, who happens to be a woman and also happens to be Asian. We cannot gloss over these things. And even though oftentimes we like to view them as symbolic, and I've even made those statements, like these are symbolic gestures, but they're not just symbolic when we start to put them in a continuum of looking at it. And we also know that Biden has doubled down with his cabinet picks. He has the most racially diverse cabinet in American history. He has pretty much the most diverse cabinet by gender in history, putting people in positions that have never been before. I mean, President Joe Biden is going to go down in history, particularly as it relates to race, potentially, and I say potentially because it's going to depend a lot on what happens over the next 2 years in particular. If Democrats hold on to the tiebreaker in 2022, okay, then 4 years. But particularly now, so what does that look like? What does he have to do? What does his administration have to do? I think it's 3 main things. First, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act must be passed. I want to quickly tell people why this is significant, because people oftentimes say, oh, well, everyone has the right to vote. Everyone does not have the right to vote in an equitable way. What do I mean by that? Well, if we go back to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, part of what that legislation did was it provided federal oversight of states, particularly southern states, but not only southern states. States in the Southwest that try to disenfranchise Latinos, states that might be in the Midwest or the East Coast that try to disenfranchise people who are low income or in rural communities. But overwhelmingly, it was put in place to protect Black people's right to vote. And if we look historically, what were some of the barriers? Well, there was something called the poll tax, which is one of the most egregious forms that we saw. Things like they would have people take a survey or a questionnaire with some of the most outlandish questions you've ever seen. How many plies are on a roll of toilet paper? How many bubbles are on a bar of soap? I mean, just stuff that's so disrespectful that for people even trying to, and then of course we know the actual blocking of people's ability to vote by beating them, killing them, hanging them. What the Voting Rights Act did, and it's a historical significance here that links to post-Reconstruction. See, during Reconstruction, after the Civil War ended, Union troops were still in southern states. They were in southern states to ensure that the laws were being followed. It's very similar to how the United States kind of does other countries, even though, you know, we could get into the details of how we might think about colonization, how we might think about overreach and these sort of things. But in the US context, it was to ensure that Black people could get to the polls to vote. And we saw more racial progress during the essentially the 10 years from the time that the Civil War ended until Reconstruction ended, that we saw over the next century. That's just how powerful these legislations are, right? So in short, when we think about this, the Voting Rights Act puts in place the ability for oversight to ensure that we don't see gerrymandering, that we don't see active voter suppression like we've been seeing. And then the second thing the Biden administration has to do is they have to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. That was with Congresswoman Karen Bass a couple of weeks ago. And of course, she's one of the main writers and co-sponsors of that legislation. It's an important piece of legislation. It will transform law enforcement. I can go into detail about that if people are interested. And then the third thing is reparations. Look, bottom line is this, and this is what Andre Perry and I laid out. It's so great to see his book behind you. I mean, look, you all's books look phenomenal. I just want to say that they look great. I love all the books. Obviously, I love books. So I always get excited when I see a lot of books. And so with reparations, one of the things that Andre Perry and I talked about, people should read his book. It's called Know Your Price. It's really highlighting the way that racial discrimination has inhibited Black people's ability to build wealth through home ownership. And what we talk about is that white people have 10 times more wealth than Black people, okay? But let's look at college educated people, because people say, oh, well, people don't work hard, or they don't, they come up with all these narratives that harken back to culture of poverty and work ethic and these sort of things. Black college graduates have 7 times less wealth than white college graduates. It's not about education. It is simply because there have been historical policies that have allowed white people to get certain things, oftentimes what they earned, not always, but oftentimes, like the GI Bill is a good example of getting what they earned. Veterans fought in World War II. They got certain types of benefits, grants to go to college, grants for small businesses, grants for homes that established the middle class, really to be specific, the white middle class. Black veterans, on the other hand, did not get that. We could also obviously go back to slavery. If we look in 1860, Black people's physical bodies, just our bodies, we're not even talking about work. We're not talking about what we produced. Our physical bodies were worth $3 billion, more than railroads and factories put together. Our country has never atoned for that. And if we're going to finally address what Congressman Hakeem Jeffries calls our genetic birth defect, meaning that our country was founded with a defect that we've never been able to get rid of, that defect being founded on on white supremacy ideology, that the only way to address that is through atonement, restitution, and reparations.
Thank you for bringing up this white affirmative action, because I think that's something that a lot of white people can't wrap their heads around, that the foundation of this country was built on giving these white Europeans wealth, giving them wealth. And then when you have people saying, well, Black people just need to work harder, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, when even Dr. Martin Luther King said, you can't pull up any boots if you have no boots.
Exactly.
So I think can you help some of our viewers understand a little bit more this white affirmative action, and just what would reparations or some kind of reconciliation look like? Because some people say, well, we need more than a check, or a check isn't going to do everything. What do you think about land?
Mm-hmm.
Or it wasn't there like a bond project for babies, or I don't know exactly. What do you think with the combination that would actually work? And could there be just some things that Biden puts into place now that could be part of some larger package, that they could create for families, and people of color who are descendants of enslaved people?
Yeah, really good question. So, and it is layered. So I appreciate how you laid that out. It's not a one size fits all. So I'll make a few main points. First thing, the key book that people should read is called When Affirmative Action Was White. Mm-hmm. When Affirmative Action Was White is written by historian Ira Katz Nelson. One of the most phenomenal books I've ever read. When I was in graduate school, it came out. It transformed how I thought about this issue and the historical legacy of racism. And part of what this book does is it lays out how we think about affirmative action. Of course, I'll talk about now, and then I'll talk about the past. I mentioned it a little bit related to the GI Bill, but I'll double down on it. So look, when it comes to affirmative action, people think there's preferential treatments. That's not how affirmative action works. Affirmative action simply allows people to get to a door that previously they couldn't even walk up to. See, people go too far with what affirmative action does. Oftentimes I hear people say, oh, it opens up doors and allows people to walk through that they shouldn't deserve to be. No, that's not what it does. It helps people get to the door where previously another group of people had steps that allowed them to walk up to the door. Another group of people didn't even have the steps to get to the door. To your point, Lynn, about what MLK said about, look, we don't have any bootstraps to even pull up, right? So affirmative action, of course, has typically been used in education. That's one of the main ways we think about it. Now, people talk about it being applied to employment, being applied to other sectors. There is no empirical evidence to suggest that that is the case at all. I'll give you a really good example, because oftentimes people can latch onto it because the sample size is small. Let's take NFL coaches. NFL has one of the most aggressive affirmative action policies. It's called the Rooney Rule. I actually think it's really, really good. So Rooney was the owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And he's notorious for hiring young coaches and really giving people a chance, like he's done with Mike Tomlin, who is one of the longest tenured coaches in the NFL and happens to be Black. He was also probably one of the youngest coaches when he was hired. I think he was like 34. Of course, he's won a Super Bowl. He's done all these things. Point in mentioning that, Rooney said that for every head coaching vacancy, we should interview an underrepresented minority for the position. That's an example of the steps getting them to the door. It doesn't mean you're going to get it, but it does mean that you're getting to the door. Now, how does this play out? Well, I think there were nearly, 10 head coaching vacancies in the NFL this past year. I don't think any of them were filled by Black coaches. So it's not even though the Rooney Rule is really powerful, it's not only about that. In the education space, let me give a little bit of history. Affirmative action actually was first mentioned by John F. Kennedy, and it was mentioned about federal contractors. Anyone who lives in the DC area knows that, look, I remember when I moved to this area and I would ask people what they did for a living, and they would say, oh, I'm a contractor. Oh, I'm a contractor. Oh, I'm a contractor. And I was like, a contractor of what? You're contracting what? And for whom? And then I finally figured out, I was like, oh, everybody is literally like a federal contractor or works for a federal contractor. Like, that's a big deal. Black people were excluded from those types of opportunities. Not just working for a person who had the contract, but also even just getting the contract. So John F. Kennedy said, I'm taking affirmative action to give Black people the chance to get it. That's when it was first used. I actually think it's one of the main reasons he was assassinated, similar to why Abraham Lincoln was assassinated after the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. So affirmative action then started being applied to education. One of the first big cases dealt with the case called University of California, Bakke versus University of California. I think it was around 1978, late 1970s. He was a student applying to medical school in California. And he said that the reason why he did not get into medical school is because Black students were admitted to him with lower scores. Supreme Court investigated it. They said, well, we don't find tons of evidence for this. And more importantly, the Black students, maybe it should even been more of them if they had equitable education in kindergarten through 12th grade and then in college, right? So let's fast forward. There was a series of other cases, but let's fast forward to the University of Michigan case, which was another famous case around early 2000s. A student alleged that she did not get into law school because Black students were admitted with lower scores than her. When they did an investigation, what they actually found was that if she brought her lawsuit in regards to gender, she actually would have won it, that men were being let in with lower scores. But people don't seem to make as big a fuss about that as they do with Black people. Instead, they didn't find that it was about race. And once again, the Supreme Court ruled that that could be the case. Let's go to Texas. What Texas started doing was and other states have done this too, but Texas started saying, look, if you finish in the top 10% of your class, of your senior class, you get you get admitted to college, like you can get a scholarship to go to college. And students became upset. In some cases, I can understand, like if you go to a really competitive high school, you might graduate with a 3.7, 3.9, 4.2, the way they do stuff now, and still like maybe only be in the top 50. Whereas you could be number one in another school and graduate with a 3.7. It's a resource issue. So part of what affirmative action was doing was simply giving people the ability to get to the door. Once again, the Supreme Court ruled that affirmative action could stay in place, but we should figure out other ways to use race. Now, that's the basis from the 60s up to the present. And it's been watered down over time where it doesn't really have the biggest impact that it's supposed to have. In California, for example, they have what's called Proposition 209, which essentially has limited the ability for affirmative action to go into effect. We see that in a lot of different places. So we have this federal legislation, and then we have state or local legislation that's doing something different. Now, historically, let me make a couple of quick points about what Ira Katz-Nelson says and how we think about when affirmative action was white, and pulling on some literature from the slave era. So when slavery officially ended, there was something that was called there was a field order. I think it was called Field Order 15. And what that field order said is that Black people would get 40 acres and a mule. Well, that never came to pass after Lincoln was assassinated. And after that, not only did that not come to pass, but former slave owners were given their land back, and some of them were given back pay for lost wages and lost property. That lost property being Black, formerly enslaved people. And Washington, D.C. was one of the main places that did that. Let's fast forward to the Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen's Bureau was a bank where Black people could put their bank and build wealth. Well, that never came to pass. And a lot of that money was robbed from them. They never received it. We then have the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act was legislation. If you ever watched Wild Wild West movies in the 70s and 80s, you'd be like, what, they're just in the middle of nowhere. What are they doing? It was Homestead Act stuff where people literally fled west and could claim land. You could just say, oh, whose land is this? Oh, it doesn't matter if American Indians are living here. I'm going to claim it. It's my land. Oh, it doesn't matter if Black people are supposed to get it. I'm going to claim this land. And that's part of what happened. And so the Homestead Act, and we're talking about millions and millions of acres of land, like over 250 million acres of land. It's not like we're talking about a little bit of land. We're talking about a crap load of land. All right, let's fast forward to another data point. World War II, we have a draft. 8 out of 10 men born during the 1920s were drafted to go to war. So that means roughly probably about 70 to 80% of families were affected by this, right? When they returned from war, as I mentioned before, white veterans were given the ability to get grants to go to college, send their kids to college, start up a business, put money down on a home. Black veterans did not get that money. Why? Because this legislation was mandated federally and implemented locally. This is why we have to have things like the Voting Rights Act and other things in place to prevent localities from reducing that. For example, like right now in Texas, Dallas said we're going to use zip code to make determinations about how to allocate COVID vaccines. That makes sense. Like, what are the hardest hitting zip codes? It's oftentimes in Dallas, it's predominantly Latino and predominantly Black zip codes. The state of Texas said, if you all do that, we will not give you the vaccine. This is what we call vaccine redlining. Vaccine gerrymandering is another thing. It's happening in our region in the DC area, where in Prince George's County, even though it's 60% Black and the most affluent, predominantly Black county in the United States, over 50% of the people who have been in line to get COVID vaccines in Prince George's County have been white. They don't live in the county, nor do they work in the county. So we see these continuous patterns. So in short, when it comes to affirmative action, the GI Bill mandated federally, implemented locally. Black veterans had to go. They couldn't go to college. They couldn't go to University of Maryland, like Perrin Mitchell, who became the first Black congressman south of the Mason-Dixon line, who had Elijah Cummings' old seat. And most people know who Elijah Cummings was. Perrin Mitchell became the first Black graduate student to take his courses on the campus of the University of Maryland. This was in 1952, and he ended up getting his master's degree, and he got that in sociology. The department chair of sociology actually testified because they had parent up sitting in a room in Baltimore. I want y'all to imagine this, 1950. It's not like we have computers. You're sitting in a room by yourself in a graduate course while there are other students on College Park's campus, and they say that that was separate and equal, right? So the sociology chair testified and said, no, it's no way that he can have separate and equal. So that case actually was one of the cases that set a precedent for Brown versus Board of Education. Of course, we had Topeka. I mean, in several other cases. Thurgood Marshall actually took Parent Mitchell's case because Parent's older brother, Clarence Mitchell, was one of President Johnson's chief advisors, and he was formerly one of the people who headed up the NAACP. These sort of things were constructed, right? But this is the reason why HBCUs started popping up everywhere. Morgan State, Coppin, I mean, all these other places. They were not meant to last. They were only put up for Black veterans. But it doesn't stop there. You have the New Deal policies. New Deal policy said that, of course, everybody knows about the New Deal. Like unemployment was sky high. It jolted the economy, allowed people to get retirement. It set minimum wages. I mean, it did all kind of stuff. It set the work week. This is where we got the 40-hour work week. We got minimum wages. We got retirement. We got all this stuff. But as much as I liked President Roosevelt, who, of course, he's one of the reasons we have term limits. I mean, he had 4 terms before he passed away. As much as I like him, he did something that was very egregious. He left out 2 occupations from New Deal legislation. He left out domestic work and farm work. Over 60% of Black people worked in those occupations. So what do we do about it? Well, look, let me tell you. Not only do we need reparations, and even though people think we need direct checks, I'm not opposed to that, but I also think what we also need are policies that deal with gateways to college, gateways to a job, gateways to home ownership, gateways to business ownership. So what does that look like? It looks like a Black New Deal. It looks like a Black GI Bill. It looks like giving Black people tuition remission for college. That colleges should pay, that states should pay. Like Virginia is doing this now, right? They just made a ruling that state schools have to grapple with the legacy of slavery and how slaves helped to bolster their endowments. Georgetown has already done this. Princeton has already done it. Other places are doing it. And I think that one of the best reparations packages looks like in the state of Maryland, the Harriet Tubman Community Investment Act being led by Delegate Juanita Fisher. I've testified on that bill the past couple of years, most recently over the past month. What this legislation says is tuition remission or loan repayment. Second, business grants to start up businesses or grants to bolster businesses, because we know, like, for example, during COVID, Black businesses have been less likely to get COVID-19 funding. In fact, 90% were denied funding and 40% of Black small businesses have closed during COVID. Down payment assistance for homes or housing revitalization grants. In this case, we're talking about revitalizing areas like Southeast DC, where instead of just gentrifying, we need to reinvest. And so I think these are the sort of things that it looks like. Now, where does the money come from? People always say, oh, well, where's it going to come from? Why do taxpayers have to pay it? I wasn't locked in. Over 25% of land in the United States is federal land. What do you do when you have land? You can sell it, you can lease it, you can do all kind of stuff with it, but you can take the money from that and fund reparations. Baby bonds is a great idea too. You give every baby born in the United States a bond that then when they turn 18 or 25, they can use that to go to college. They can use it for a home. Of course, that's being pushed by Derek Hamilton and Sandy Darity, but phenomenal ideas.
Thank you. And it makes sense. It just sounds like, it's all about making space for Black people, investing and honoring in our legacy as Americans. I hope that we can get at least something passed in the next 2 years. I mean, even sooner if possible, because we've been waiting a long time for this. And people really need, people need to feel like they belong and that they're part of this country, which we all are as Black people. So thank you for, sharing your thoughts of what reparations would look like. It's really helpful. And we had a couple of questions. Do we have any questions from the viewers? Yeah, there was just some comments about, creating generational wealth, that we never really had that opportunity. So those would be good opportunities to be able to bring some of that generational wealth into the Black community.
Can I just mention something about, in Germany, they gave reparations. And at the time, it wasn't popular. And I think that, there has been a little bit movement in America in terms of how white people see reparations, but we're still not, majority of white people thinking that this is something that needs to happen. What do you think in terms of, a backlash or, certainly what the work we're doing with the Anti-Racist Table to try to educate people, when people understand the history of why this is so critical, why this is morally right. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. So, I mean, on the first front, you mentioned the Holocaust and reparations for Jews and others who were persecuted then. So I spent some time living in Germany. I lived there for about 6 months. I was teaching at the University of Mannheim in Germany. And I studied Nazism. Like, I wanted to understand how it was able to take hold, how it was able to rise. And I remember when Trump got elected, it freaked me out so much because the components were there to end up like what we saw on the Capitol a couple of months ago or 6 weeks ago. And it's not far-fetched. I mean, that's definitely not the end of it. So, I mean, you're right. Look, people who were impacted by the Holocaust received reparations. American Indians have received reparations. Not as much as they should have, but they've received land, they've received direct payments. Japanese Americans who were interned received reparations. And let me be even more specific. The descendants of some of these individuals have received reparations. So people act like that we don't have a model. We have multiple models for this. And in Congress right now, there are two pieces of legislation. In fact, Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Senator Cory Booker just reintroduced the Truth and Reconciliation Bill. I've been serving on an ad hoc congressional committee of people who are aiming to push this legislation. And that is HCON Resolution 100. Truth and Reconciliation Bill is very similar to what Dr. Shirley Weber, who is now I think the California Secretary of State, helped to push in California. And then of course we have HR 40, which is the reparations bill. I find the hesitancy with that bill to be fascinating because all that bill is saying right now is to establish a commission to study what it would look like. Like the resistance just to say we're gonna study it. Yeah. I'm gonna tell you what the resistance is about. What the resistance is about is the people who most resisted. They understand that when people really, truly understand the history of America, that they're going to be more likely to support it. This is the reason why about 40%, if not close, I would imagine probably 50 or 60% now of young adults, people who are under 40, support reparations. Because the 40% was actually before the past year. I would imagine that's increased. So, I mean, those legislations are really, really important. And we have a track record for what it looks like. And Black people are the only group of people who have been systematically discriminated against and prosecuted by the state, meaning the nation state, the government, to not receive reparations.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where I'm wondering if it's that zero-sum narrative that these people just feel like they're going to take something from me and I'm not going to have what I need. Why can't we come out of this place of abundance, this abundance narrative that there's room for everyone. There's enough money for everyone.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's some fascinating research on racial attitudes that I love. So my main specialty is social psychology. So, I mean, of course, I study race, I study policing and criminal justice reform and health disparities and voting and family. I mean, I study all these things, but I primarily come at it from a social psychological standpoint that really links it to social institutions. And the zero sum game is really big among white people. Like they view the glass as half empty instead of something that can be half full. And part of what the narrative is driven by is a comparison between whites and non-whites. Like it's instead of viewing our country as pluralistic and even the world as having a series of racial groups and a series of different ethnicities with a multitude of nationalities, a lot of white Americans view the world as white, non-white. So you hear statements like, oh, in 2050, white people are going to be the minority. No, they're not. They're only going to be the minority if you compare all non-white people to white people. And last time I checked, all non-white people don't have the same interest. They don't have the same political ideologies. They don't have the same experiences. They don't have the same cultures, and we shouldn't group them together. And so I mean, when we think about this, the zero-sum game, one of the biggest things that I know about people is when you ask them what they think on some of these issues, and they talk about kind of an us versus them or zero-sum game, it instantly lets me know what they think about a host of other issues because it's that strong of a factor.
Yeah, that's important stuff. We wanted to talk a little bit about COVID, and we've just surpassed, over 500,000 human beings in America have lost their lives. And you've written about the racial disparities. What's important for people to know about that?
There are a few stats. So I'm finishing up a report like ASAP that's coming out on Monday on racial disparities for COVID in Detroit. And Detroit, of course, has been one of the hardest hit cities. Michigan has, I think it's like fourth in the country in terms of the racial gap. And when I think about COVID, I think about it simply, which is that there's a saying in the Black community, which is that when America catches a cold, Black people get the flu. Well, one thing I've been saying is that during COVID, when America catches COVID, Black people die. And that's literally what's been happening. I mentioned the racial disparities earlier to show people how, just sobering it is. 1 out of every 750 Black people can expect to die from COVID. 1 out of every 750. And Black people, followed not far by Latinos, are much more likely to either have contracted COVID themselves, have a family member or close friend who has not only contracted COVID, but died from COVID. Part of what people have to realize about this, it's not about Black people's blood or our behavior. Everybody's out doing things they shouldn't be doing during COVID, at least my risk-averse self would say. But more importantly, what most people are doing are having to work essential jobs, because if they don't go to work, they don't get paid. Restaurant workers, grocery store workers, public transit. Black people are overrepresented in all of those occupations. In fact, Black people represent 20% of part of this new essential workforce, 30% of public transit workers. And so when we put all this together, it suggests that social distancing is a privilege, right? That it's one of those things where if you have a job that doesn't allow you to work from home, then you're overly exposed. Then that sends a ripple effect. It's what we call COVID-19 illness spillovers, where now it starts to affect the education of your kids. It starts to affect employment. It starts to affect your ability to get the resources you need. And here goes the key stat that is really, really troubling. Black people are early on during COVID were 6 times more likely to be turned away from COVID-19 testing and treatment when they went to the hospital. 6 times more likely. Our bodies are just viewed as less valuable to save. People would be called out, like paramedics would be called out, and they would make decisions on whether or not they thought that person would live. And they would just assume that they wouldn't, like Dr. Susan Moore in Indianapolis. Like a young man who's 39 years old in St. Louis, who went to the hospital 3 times saying that he was sick. They kept turning him away. He died in the parking lot of the hospital. 39. Like, these are the types of things that when I think about COVID, look, COVID simply exacerbated what we already knew. And there's a broad study that's important for people to note as well. There was a Johns Hopkins led, ironically, Hopkins, given their history with Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks and the Guatemalan syphilis study. But nonetheless, they put out this pandemic response report a couple of years ago. Hundreds of countries. What it found was that the United States was #1 in finances for healthcare and almost dead last in healthcare equity. So if you have money and you have insurance, life's going to be great for you. If you don't, life is going to suck. And life typically sucks more for people of color, Black people, and low-income people than others.
Yeah, that just hit home saying, you know, social distance is privilege. That's so powerful. And, you know, what you were talking about before, how there's certain federally, federally mandated, but they're implemented locally, these different, you know, laws and policies. Are there certain things in place right now that are in this new COVID package that Biden is looking at kind of rolling out that's going to help with some of those disparities in the kind of health department for, you know, Black and brown people who need the support? Or is there nothing really new that he's trying to roll out?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a couple of important wrinkles. That it's still sad that it's so late. Like, so one of the big things I advocate for next week, Tuesday at 1 p.m., we're going to actually be talking about the COVID Detroit study. And one of the things about it is one of the recommendations I've had that, like, in New York, they picked up, they're starting to pick it up, even in our area, which is to put vaccination sites similar to testing sites in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods. Instantly helps address distrust. Black people have a rational distrust of medicine and healthcare. Rational, like we should be. When you know the history of Henrietta Lacks, how her cells were stolen without her knowledge, she ended up dying. Then these cells helped to actually find cures for pretty much most of the diseases that have impacted us. And so we think about that. And of course, people know about Tuskegee, and people say, oh, well, Tuskegee was so long ago. Well, this is the thing. It's the collective memory of Tuskegee. Yeah. Because and it hasn't been that far away. Like there's a woman who goes to church with me, Major Sharon Hawk. She was a major in the Air Force. Her grandfather was a victim in Tuskegee. But let me tell you how it transforms. She stood up. Now, of course, this was virtual, but she stood up at our church and said, I'm going to get the vaccine after telling the story of her grandfather. You know what that meant? At Reed Temple African Methodist Episcopal Church, Reed Temple AME Church, they have a vaccination site in Prince George's County. 1,600 people were vaccinated, most of whom were Black. When at the large Six Flags site down the street, overwhelmingly it hasn't been Black. Even at the Sports and Learning Complex in Prince George's County, that hasn't been the case. So you have to put these vaccination sites in predominantly Black and Latino areas. Churches is the main pathway. Community centers are a good idea too, but particularly churches, because people trust that space. It's about instantly being able to deal with trust.
Right. And also maybe even just accessibility. Like if people are working these long hours, they aren't going to be able to stop and go get an appointment at 2:00 in the afternoon. You know,
exactly.
Like evening hours, midnight hours. Yeah, being flexible, making space for all of that.
Exactly.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, so our time is quickly, Lynn, it's 8:53. So we did want to save a little bit of time to talk about, you know, bring some excellence and some joy, because, you know, all the things we're talking about are so heavy, and just, you know, we as Black people have to find joy and take care of ourselves, and, you know, find beauty and all of those things that really help us persevere and get through these really difficult times. So
thrive. Yeah, we don't want to survive.
Right, so we thrive. Here. So we wanted to ask you, you know, just for fun, what are you reading and watching now? What is making you happy and bringing you joy?
What's making me happy? Yeah, my youngest son, who is easily has become one of the funniest people I know, which is saying a lot because I know some really, really funny people, and I have to talk to them all the time to make me laugh. But I mean, he is easily top 3. He'll probably be #1 by the time he's 16, I'm sure, because he's starting to realize he's funny. You know, that's the difference, right? It's like, it's one thing to be funny, you're kind of getting laughed at, But when you know you're funny, you're being laughed with.
Oh,
And
yeah.
he's starting to realize that. But we watch a show every Friday on Disney called The Secrets of Sulphur Springs. And it's like a mystery show for kids. And he loves mysteries like I do. So, I mean, like we've been binge watching Scooby-Doo during the pandemic. That was one of my favorite shows growing up. He loves it. I mean, that's the show that's on my mind right now. In terms of what I'm reading, oh geez. I mean, I read so much stuff that I don't even have the time to read like all the things that I want to read. But one of the things that I was doing recently was my kids had Black History Month assignments, projects. So I have a 9 and 10-year-old, so they're in 3rd and 4th grade. And again, with my youngest, he chose Sarah Boone, who invented the ironing board, right? So they're learning all these things about who invented what. So he's setting the iron up. He has his shirts out. My oldest son, he chose Ruby Bridges, who was the student who essentially desegregated schools. They chose these people on their own. I didn't tell them. I mean, like I have, a collection of books. So obviously they come in and look at all types of stuff, and I have these collection of biographies. But I mean, I would say I'm reading what they're reading, and then I'm proofreading all of my stuff. But I definitely watch a lot of TV. I watch a lot of HGTV. I love HGTV. House Hunters is my favorite show. But I also like, Old Town, which is about being in the South. I'm originally from Tennessee. I like Love It Enlisted. I mean, I try to watch stuff that kind of takes my mind off my work.
Shows. Yeah,
There's some good shows.
The Secret of the Sulphur Springs, because I have
to show.
I want to see that. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you.
House Hunters was a favorite of mine, and my son and I used to love that Love It or List It, which we saw recently.
Kind of house in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
That's my
what is one thing, if you wanted to leave people with like one tangible thing people can really do right now to make a difference? There's all these things going on, encouraging people to step into their power and to realize that they do have power, and that what each person does really does matter.
Yeah, look, I think we all have a role to play. And when I think about what we can do, we can start with the people who we love the most. If all of us had conversations like this with the people we love the most, or even just love, you don't even have to love them the most. I guess love is relative. But if you just love them, if you have conversations with people you love, your family even, we would have covered everybody on the globe. Just start there. It's simple. Conversations at your dinner table. Come to the table and talk anti-racism. So what does it look like? Well, I have a 3-step hierarchy that I like to talk about as it relates to what it means to become a racial equity advocate, okay? You first start out being a racial equity learner. You have to learn about this stuff. That's part of what we're doing tonight. Second, you become a racial equity advocate. That means speaking up and speaking out for people who cannot speak up for themselves, meaning all of us are sitting at different tables, oftentimes with people who look very similar to us, or at least think very similar to us, have a similar socioeconomic status as us, or else they probably wouldn't be in our house. So start there. Because one thing I learned from living in Germany, when I would hear Germans talk about Turks, which people from Turkey is the largest ethnic group in Germany, they'll make crazy statements like, oh, you got to watch out when you go over there. You got to, and I would say, nothing is happening to me over there. And I started realizing, I remember one day walking back to our flat, I told my wife, I said, I think that's how white people talk about Black people in America, but we've never been sitting at the table to hear it. So it's up for people to speak up and speak out for other people. My grandfather served 21 years in the military, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, served in 2 wars. He was a drill sergeant. He taught me my silence is my acceptance. Don't allow your silence to be your acceptance, because that silence can lead to someone else's oppression. Final thing is to become a racial equity broker. Interrogate the rules, laws, regulations, and procedures where you work, where you play, where you worship, where you sleep. If you do that, you start to uncover things that are problematic, and you can work to change it and then implement racially equitable policies to ensure They say when Black people are moving into your neighborhood or trying to sell their house, that their house doesn't appraise for less, or that there are certain clauses that prevent them from gaining access to the same sort of resources. Or asking ourselves why, when we go worship at a place, almost everybody looks like us. Like, as MLK said, the most segregated time in America is Sunday morning. Like, how can we do something about people's hearts if the place where we go to supposedly fill our hearts is filled with so much segregation? So I think that's what people have to do. Racial equity learner, racial equity advocate, racial equity broker.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for all that wisdom and making it so simple for everyone to do this work, right? It's 3 simple steps.
Yeah, we're gonna write them down and we're putting them everywhere.
Yeah,
We're gonna put your name next to it. Don't worry, but we love it. We want to let you plug anything you want to plug right now before we wrap up.
Yeah,
well,
where
sure.
can we follow you and learn from you?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm on social media at Sociologist Ray. So I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook. I hadn't got down with some of the other ones yet, but those are the main 3 that I use. So at Sociologist Ray, people can follow me there. As I mentioned, next week we have a huge report at Brookings coming out on examining and addressing racial health disparities in Detroit. It's going to be a powerful event. It's Tuesday at 1 p.m. And I mean, it features people at the local and state level who are doing a lot of things. But I mean, when you follow me on social media, I pretty much try to send out everything that I'm working on. And then, on my website, RashawnRay.com, Rashawn without a Y in my first name, RASHAWN, Ray.com. And then you can literally search my name in Brookings and you can find all the work that I've been writing on over the past few years.
Yeah, and we'll send that out to everybody too with this recording.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. Lynn, did you want to show our slides? We have some upcoming events coming. Hope you guys will come back and see us at the Anti-Racist Table. You can check us out at www.theantiracist.table.com. And if you would like to support our work, you can buy us a cup of coffee. Yeah, we can leave it at that. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this riveting and powerful conversation. And thank you so much to Dr. Ray for your time and your wisdom, dropping knowledge like nobody's business. So until next time, we'll see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.